I'm very excited about this video, so I will break it up into multiple videos, 10 minutes long because it has a 10-page script. So here we go. The term Mfecane is of British imagination and origin. It doesn't exist in the Proto-Bantu language, and the British are pretty confused about whether it is Zulu or Suru-Swana, which are Bantu-derived languages. According to British historians, the Mfecane represents a time of great cruelty and violence in southern Africa, when violence by Africans on Africans in the east was at an all-time high, but somehow the Afrikaners and the British, who were the cause of it in the west and carrying out a Cape slave trade, are left out of it. When we scrutinize the British sources, we find that the Mfecane is actually a cover-up by the British to hide their activities in southern Africa, which included and are not limited to genocide, human abduction and trafficking, depopulation, instigating intra-tribal warfare, funding and arming the Griqua mercenaries, witchcraft, sexual assault and violence, forced imprisonment, theft of cattle, relics, gold, and personal property of Africans, and theft of African land. Fortunately, this time, I am not the first person to see this, unlike the Bantu Migration Never Happened video I created. Julian Cobbing and Daniel Wiley did see it too and wrote about it. Maybe not the witchcraft part, but there was witchcraft. I have linked their papers in the description box. I think it is important that we scrutinize African history and get a factually correct account of it, regardless of whose feelings it stings. It's the only way we would do better and have a safe and secure continent with better outcomes for everyone, not just a few. The events associated with the Mfecane were created as an alibi for the British to hide their activities in southern Africa, which included slave trading, genocide, and depopulation, to make way for their European settlement dream. In this world that they would claim, the land was empty except for Africans in serfdom, who would form the cheap labor force and consumer base for British goods, cycling the wealth back into their pockets. They created the Mfecane to hide how they dabbled in witchcraft, colluded with witches, warlords, stole relics, raided tombs, and attempted to erase the connection to ancient Egypt. It gets even crazier, but keep in mind that Cecil Rhodes is not buried in Westminster. He is buried on a Proto-Bantu sacred mountain because they found what their beliefs could not explain. If you don't believe in African sciences, Julian Cobbing and Daniel Wiley show it was a cover-up by following the laws. I also use culture and language of the Botswana specifically that have certain elements that are out of place in southern Africa, and we all come to the same conclusion. It was a cover-up, and it was beyond terrible. It still is beyond terrible. I will do another video on how exactly they created the Mfecane. These videos are simply pointing out the red flags that were already there. The term Mfecane was coined around 1928, which is also a very significant year in South African politics, which saw the push for the Afrikaner nationalism and identity and segregation policies, which were attempts to legitimize Dutch, German, French settler identity and claims to African land, which they said was empty or belonged to the Khoi, whose descendants were now multiracial Griqua or Coloureds, who were also Dutch, German, and French, giving them a claim to the land. Although, to be fair, I think this would just be the Cape area, but the idea is that these Khoi ancestors had been murdered by Shaka and the Bantu during the Mfecane. This is not true. The Khoi were rendered serfs by the Dutch, and Shaka was actually of Nilo-Saharan heritage, hired first by the Portuguese and then by the British, who promised him refuge in England and hair dye to keep him looking young if he continued the attacks on his neighbors and enslaved people, who were then sold to the Portuguese at Delagoa Bay. The Proto-Bantu had nothing to do with that violence, well, mostly nothing, because they were mostly invisible. That's why Inganga exists. or the hill of Inyanga exists, because that was where they were believed to have had powers to do things that people could not believe they could do. And that was on the eastern side of Africa. Between the Kalahari and Great Zimbabwe, there was another kingdom, which was their capital right there, which they held on to until 1838. I get to it at the end of this video. But the Proto-Bantu had nothing to do with the violence. It was the Nilo-Saharan mercenaries, who might also be ancestors of the Khoi, and we will get to that in another video, but with this one we will start with the language. British historians usually claim that the word Mfecane is a Bantu word from either Zulu or Tswana Sotho, and that it means the crushing. They can never seem to make up their minds as to what it really means, so it changes every generation or so. But fortunately for them, we have the Proto-Bantu dictionary, and we can figure out what it means if it is a Proto-Bantu expression, so we will humor them and help them out. Proto-Bantu language, from which all Bantu languages are derived, does not have the di or li as pronoun prefixes. So this immediately tells us this comes from whatever language is mixed in to create Zulu or Sotho Tswana, because this is not a pure Bantu or Proto-Bantu word. Because in the Proto-Bantu language, li means most beautiful sound, and di is a synonym for depth, two ideas that have nothing to do with crushing, suffering, or starving. So if we assume it is of Sotho origin, and that is Sotho Tswana, this places the word into the Nilo-Saharan language group, because Sotho Tswana and Nguni languages have Nilo-Saharan admixture. This is why Sotho has a distinct accent to Nilo-Saharan languages and adds the ng or ng sound to their words, and also has double consonants, some of which can be attributed to the sun. Sotho and Tswana did not experience the Proto-Bantu backflip, meaning that there were Proto-Bantu people that were assimilated in these populations between the 1600s to the 1800s, after that initial first assimilation in the 1100s like the Nkosa or Zulu had. This would mean that a paramount contribution to the language comes from the Nilo-Saharan language group, who make use of the ng sound, as in Tlaping, Mfecane, Maroteng, Rolong, and we find the same sound in words in the Nilo-Saharan languages too, like Indang, which means mother, Deng is rain, Tang is to make. I hope I'm not butchering those too much. Now, of course, this isn't enough, but when we look at the Nguni style of building houses, they have the same traditional beehive homes that can be traced back to the Nilo-Saharans and are found everywhere in Oromo history. Then there's the practice of living in a kraal, which is also practiced by Nilo-Saharans and not Proto-Bantu. I always wondered why the British writers called them their minzies, kraals. I couldn't understand it. It was strange to me to live in the same space as your cows. We love our cows, but they are on the outside of the munzi. So I looked further into it, and I found that it's actually a Nilo-Saharan practice to have the kraal part of the village, so somebody can walk out and into the kraal in some cultures, in some Nilo-Saharan cultures, not all. But the use of cow dung is also another prominent practice among Nilo-Saharan people. They use it to build homes, seal their baskets, and there's nothing wrong with it. This is their custom. It just isn't ours as Proto-Bantu. They also serve guest milk, which we don't. We serve chiwantu or uchwala, which is the fermented grain drink. I won't call it beer because children drink it too, and it has a weak alcohol content unless it is fermented longer or made differently in some cases. So the presence of the Nilo-Saharan cultural practices and languages is how we know that the native Proto-Bantu were invaded by Nilo-Saharan people, and this resulted in the formation of the Sutu-Swana-Nguni language groups, who have elements of Nilo-Saharan culture and Proto-Bantu culture. The Nkosa don't seem to have suffered a large loss of Proto-Bantu in their population, a loss large enough to have been dominated by Nilo-Saharans. This means they were Nilo-Saharans in southern Africa, which isn't their original home, which is why they faced major adjustments when it came to hunting and living here. So in the next video, we will cover how the Nilo-Saharans ended up in southern Africa, which was home to the San and the Proto-Bantu. I hope you like this video and follow along in the next video. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and we do appreciate your support to our Ko-fi account, and the link is in the description box. To all the people that have supported us so far, thank you so much. It goes a long way. See you in the next video.